For this episode, I spoke with Avelo, a very funny and insightful trans comedian who seems to be blowing up all over Germany. Recently appeared in Icky Mail video and more, is famous for doing Burnt das Brot impressions, a lot of followers on TikTok and on Instagram. And I really enjoyed this conversation because I felt like we went really deep into the strengths and also the weaknesses of certain ways of doing politics for minorities, often described as identity politics, and how she's learned about what she's learned about being a woman in the world through her transition, and how queer politics has changed in our lifetimes and more. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation. Have some patience with us and stay mad. Welcome to another episode of Mad in Germany. I think this one's going to be a little bit different. I'm wearing the same shirt I did in the first episode because I just think we're going to go in a slightly different direction. You know, one thing I like about this podcast is we can cover the really big issues from the Straits of Hormuz to the new Icky Mail video. So with me, I have Avelo, who is a musician, video essayist, content creator who's been blowing up a lot in Germany and is from the US originally, and is also in the middle of like quite a prominent legal battle about trans rights in Germany. So welcome to the podcast, Avelo. And what can you tell us a little bit about this legal battle?
Yeah. So I was looking for a fitness studio where I could train. I wanted to go to a Frauenfitness studio, and I had heard that this fitness studio that was in my neighborhood was where I had heard that someone I knew, a trans woman, was allegedly not allowed to join. And I thought, well, looking for a new place to go. So this is in the neighborhood, let's go there. And I signed up at this gym. People generally don't clock me as trans in my life. Like, and by that I mean that they don't usually recognize that I'm trans. And so I thought it would be interesting if I could train at this gym. And I was successful in registering. I needed somewhere to train, so I started going there regularly. I went there a few times over the course of like 2 weeks, minding my business, just doing the elliptical and stuff. And then I was making TikTok videos about it because I think it was an interesting experience that I wanted to share with people. And then after 2 weeks, I decided that I wanted to disclose that I was trans, or that I am trans. And the week before, I had called them using my friend's phone to see if I could join as a hypothetical trans woman, and I was told no. And then when I asked if I was about to have my sex change, could I do it then? They said, yeah, then. But even though I've had my sex change, I knew that to my knowledge, that doesn't seem to be in accordance with the Allgemeine Gleichbehandlungsgesetz.
Which is the general anti-discrimination
law.
law.
The general anti-discrimination law that certain politicians have said that trans people are covered under. So I told them I'm trans. They asked me if I've been umoperiert, like if I've had the operation or whatever. I avoided answering, and then I was not allowed to. My contract was terminated.
What justification did they give?
They didn't give any at first because thankfully, my manager was there as a witnesses interaction. And then they said they would give me an email stating why my membership was canceled, but they never did. They just gave me an email saying my membership was canceled, even though I never asked them to. And I called later that day. They weren't answering my phone calls either. So I used another friend's phone to call the studio. And that friend was a witness to this phone call. And on that phone call, I asked them, I said I was told I would be given a reason. And the woman on the phone said, "Wir sind ein reines Frauenfitnessstudio."
Pure.
And
woman.
Pure.
Okay.
And that was why I wasn't allowed to go there.
And so because you're a trans woman, for them, you don't count as pure woman.
That appears to be the implication.
Okay. Wow. That's quite interesting. My home country, there's a lot of issues around trans rights for women in the UK. But I kind of thought in Germany, the rules were quite clear that you're not allowed to discriminate against trans women. Also, for example, purposefully misgendering a trans woman can actually be illegal, right?
I don't think it can in Germany.
I think it can.
You have to prove that they intended to disrespect you.
Right.
Yeah. It's one of the things I think I'm shocked to figure out that misgendering someone isn't automatically a Beleidigung. You have to prove their intent, that they intended to dishonor you.
But I remember
which is very difficult.
I remember in the Selbstbestimmungsgesetz, the self-determination law, there was like a clause about it counts as some kind of Beleidigung, right? Like,
I'm not sure.
Not just as the Beleidigungsgesetz, but there was something special in the law that changed because there was some news reporting about this, and some people said, well, that's a bit much, because and the classic case would have been the Green politician Tessa Ganserer, who's one of the first 2 trans politicians elected in Germany, and I think actually they were, the AfD used her dead name. She's now left parliament in part because of all of the abuse. And I think, here the loophole was that she hadn't officially changed her gender using what was then the so-called transsexual law. So actually, they were allowed to call her by her dead name.
Yeah.
But I think if you go through it with the whole new the new law, the self-determination law, then technically they're not allowed to. But maybe it's hard to prove intent.
Well, I think it's also dependent on situations. Like, I think if someone were to aggressively, I actually I don't know how that works legally, but I saw a thing recently where someone was arguing a trans woman was misgendering a non-binary person and saying that it didn't count as a Beleidigung because it would be hard to prove her intent or something. It was very weird.
Interesting. And I guess also with another legal case could be kind of like neo-pronouns, or non-binary is a little bit grammatically tricky in German,
right? I think if someone's binary, it might be easier to prove in court that you were trying to disrespect them. But unfortunately for people whose identities aren't like legally recognized, or at least not socially recognized, I think unfortunately it's harder to then prove that, which is why I probably heard some stories that made me think, so it probably isn't illegal.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Let's not get too bogged down in the law. This is not a legal podcast. Although I do think law is very important for understanding, the rights you have and stuff. But when did you transition?
I transitioned, or I started about 4 years ago. Or a little over 4 years ago.
Okay. Yeah. And you mentioned, you called it the sex change before, I think. Is that kind of seen as a bit old-fashioned somehow?
Yeah, but I'm old-fashioned. Yeah, no, I think the
I've heard it called gender affirmation surgery.
Yeah, gender affirmation surgery.
You don't seem like you like that.
I don't really like it. Because I think something that I personally take issue with how certain aspects of liberal gender politics have like described transness is specifically the idea that like sex is different than gender and you can't change sex, but you can change gender. When in reality, you can change sex. Sex is not chromosomes. Sex is a bunch of different physical categories. Secondary sex characteristics, chromosomes are a part of it. But there are many things that doctors use to categorize what the sex of someone is. And if you change 6 out of 7 of them, as far as I'm concerned, your sex has changed. Right. And medically speaking, it's more accurate to tell them to list me as like weiblich then. In that case.
That's so interesting.
So that's why I say sex change, because I do think of it as like changing my sex.
That is so interesting.
Yeah.
And, you mentioned liberal gender politics. I think, this is one thing I really wanted to discuss with you, because you do have a bit of a Maybe untrendy is the right word for it. Like you have a bit of an approach to some of these questions which goes against the grain of the stuff that we're hearing on TikTok, on Instagram, and even from certain government funded and government backed kind of narratives on this stuff, like the one you just said, that we shouldn't focus on gender, right? Gender is a word that sends a certain breed of German conservatives absolutely wild. But also in the US, right? I just watched the Louis Theroux Manosphere documentary, and they were talking about this, how gender politics is what's sending the West to corruption. But you have a bit of a different perspective, and you're what we would call like a binary trans person, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So you went from like a man to a woman, just to put it in the most simplistic way possible.
Yeah, no. Well, I went from a gay man to a straight woman. Yeah.
So there's the sexuality aspect in it as well.
Yeah.
But would you say some people also go from like some people it changes who they're attracted to as well, right? Their sex.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I was waiting for that other shoe to drop for like many years, but it just never happened. Yeah. I don't know. I'm one of like very few people I know whose sexuality hasn't changed because of hormone therapy. Yeah.
Wow. And how did you go? How has the experience been for you? Like, how differently do you feel in the world? How, especially if you, as you say, you pass, like you have like a really unique insight in how the world works for men and women and queer people in a sense. I'm just really curious.
I think, I think the whole experience has been fabulous. I love it. It's kind of it's a hard feeling to describe, I feel like, to someone who hasn't gone through something like that, because it's so deeply distressing to, like, at the time when I decided to transition, I was happily married to a gay man. And so that was a huge weight on my shoulders. Like, I was also very publicly out in my work and like very queer positive. And so I was like, why do I fucking hate myself?
Publicly out as gay.
Yeah, publicly out as gay. And
you used to be a video essayist, right?
Yeah.
I actually think I used to follow you.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, and then I saw you transition, and the you focus more on like music and stuff now, right? But so yeah, how was that experience?
It was I think it took a bit to get started. I think society it was a struggle for me to even start that process, because I think growing up, I was very into very masculine men. And when I discovered that my body went in that direction on its own, I was kind of just like, okay, well, I guess I'll just do that. And I had a lot of fun years fetishizing masculinity. I think it's funny how transphobic people often talk about transition as like fetishizing femininity or something. But for me, it was, and for a lot of trans people I know, it was actually the opposite. Like, we found masculinity attractive, so we tried to embody that as much as possible. And it took me a while, I think many years, even though I could tell stories about when I should have known it sooner. But it took into my late 20s for me to be like, okay, every aspect of who I am is not me. Like, it's just what I find hot. I was
wow.
I had a beard. I was very hairy. I was very masculine, or at least trying my fucking best. And it was just out of this sort of like attractiveness. And
you were a little bit autosexual in a sense.
Yeah, I don't think I ever jerked off to myself, but I was clearly in that like gay sphere of like men having boyfriends who look exactly like them.
Oh yeah, the boyfriend twin.
Yeah, exactly. And so and I thought that was hot. I still maintain that the only thing hotter than one gay man is two. And so it was fine to play with that for a while, but then I think in my 20s the severe bodily discomfort I was having, like very surreal feelings. I was having all these mysterious health problems that were popping up, and which all went away as soon as I started taking hormones.
Wow. And so you think it was like psychosomatic in a sense, like manifested in your body, your kind of internal turmoil in a way?
I think it's I think the medical term is just gender dysphoria, but I think the way it manifests is really interesting. It felt like I was playing a video game and I had like a character that other people recognized as me, but it didn't feel like me. And we've seen that throughout history, like not described in transness. Like an example that comes to mind is Alan Turing. When he was chemically castrated, he was given estrogen and he became really depressed. And it appears that maybe he might have experienced gender dysphoria from having a hormone that was not identical with his identity or social role or bodily whatever. And so it's like a really unique form of depression. And I was going to doctors who couldn't tell me what was wrong. I was diagnosed with like derealization. Like
I don't even know what that is.
It's like a weird term to refer to people who smoke too much weed and then like they just like don't really feel connected with their body.
Okay.
It's a harsh generalization.
Sure.
But
Mad in Germany has grown to be a platform where we can really talk about issues that the mainstream media, particularly in Germany, ignores and provide a different, more critical perspective. If you appreciate that perspective and hearing the voices that we put onto the channel, then please consider donating to Patreon. Was there a moment when the pfennig dropped and you were like, I'm a woman?
Yeah, there was one I mean this I think this is when I started to transition. There was one time where I was like on the way to work and I was looking in the U-Bahn glass and I was like, oh, I'm gonna fucking kill myself because my life doesn't belong to me. And I think because of how cruel society treats trans people, I had known some trans women in my life up until that point. I think I was just really afraid of throwing away all this like security in my life for something that I think I needed. But I did it and it was hard for a while, but now it's fabulous. Like now I feel so confident in myself and my body and my relationships with other people that I just never thought was even possible. So very pro that.
So you were kind of like a bit of a neurotic, anxious man, effectively.
I was such a sad, anxious, insecure man. Yeah, I was not fun to be around. Yeah.
Well, you're very fun to be around now.
Now I am.
Yeah.
Yeah. But before I was kind of desperate.
Right. That's so
like the last person to leave the party. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you're making me feel good about being the first person to leave the party, but it's just because I'm getting old and I like my sleep now. And I also don't want to be like in the dregs, the people who are left there hunting for whatever. And so what about you? You did your transition in Germany, right?
Yeah.
How was that whole experience in terms of the medical care, the social impact, the legal side of things, forgetting the gym for a minute?
Yeah. It's a quite degrading system in Germany, but I was able to navigate it with relative ease because I'm white. I speak German.
You speak really good German.
Yeah.
You kind of go viral for your Bernd das Brot impression.
Yeah.
Let's come on to that later.
For some reason, I can speak good German, even though I haven't studied it. But being able to do that, being also binary, like being very specific in how I present myself in a way that seems to, I'm not intentionally catering to stereotypes, but I seem to fit them very easily. These are all things that make it very easy for doctors to diagnose me, give me access to life-saving medication and stuff. Like I have a friend of mine who's a trans woman was turned away from her endocrinologist because she wore jeans to her appointment, and he said, "I don't think you're really serious about being a woman."
Oh my God!
So it's like Germany founded trans medicine in like the 1910s, 20s, and or at least the modern form of it. And it seems like it's still stuck there in many ways, culturally. But yeah, so it's not easy, but I was able to do it.
I mean, what bit for you made it tough? If actually you had quite, you said it was easier because of all of these things, but you still said it was like dehumanizing or degrading, I think.
Yeah, because I think a lot of trans medicine, unfortunately, is people who aren't trans making decisions about what trans people can do with their bodies. And this is a practice that has gone back, to when trans medicine was invented by Magnus Hirschfeld in Berlin. I think there's a guy, Sorry, I don't want to get too specific about names, but there was a guy, Harry Benjamin, who was a doctor in the 50s, who published like the text on trans people. And that's kind of what the modern day approach uses, which is sort of like trans people have to be a certain way. For a long time, trans people couldn't be gay. If you transitioned, you had to be straight or else you wouldn't be able to get hormones.
There was actually a curio in the Nazi law, by the way, about this, which was that you were actually allowed to transition under the Nazis, but if you were gay, it was seen as like a double penalty and you would basically be killed. But if you were a kind of a straight trans person, then that was actually kind of okay. I was told once by an expert, but there is some historical debate about that.
Yeah. I think even in the Nazi time, trans people were discriminated against, regardless of how they presented.
Sure, but I think they were. It was kind of seen as much worse if you were gay, and so there's this kind of debate right now about LGB without the T. Which is like gay and bisexual people. They're like, why do we need to be with trans people? It's actually quite a different thing. One is about sexuality, who you love. The other is about, your personhood. And nowadays, it's kind of seen as LGBT without the T is like almost more privileged people who have who are part of an invisible minority, kind of against the trans people. But actually, as I understood it, throughout some other times in German history, trans people were actually better off than gay people. And you could even say in Iran today, for example, because you're actually allowed to transition, and a lot of gay men are under pressure to transition in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Because, so it's interesting how things change. How do you feel about the whole LGB without the T thing?
Oh, it's hard to respect something that I think is just so painfully dumb. And the reason why I think I think the reason why I look so down on that is that I think it fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of that, acronym in the first place. And it also makes it seem like it's much simpler than it actually is. I think what people who support that might be surprised to learn about is that there were discussions in the 20th century about if lesbians had enough in common with gay people, with gay men, to be considered part of the same movement. They suffer different types of social discrimination.
In many cases, it wasn't illegal to be lesbian, where it was illegal to be
so
gay,
it's like
right?
so it's like these discussions about like why are we looped together or why are we associated even though we're not exactly the same. It's like that's not the point. The reason why those things are associated is because people have been discriminated against and oppressed by society in similar ways. I mean, the police who is transphobic isn't really going to care if it's a gay man in a dress versus a non-passing trans woman in a dress. And that's always been the case throughout history. So that's why there's a community around people, not because that their identities are similar, but because that they were all discriminated against in a certain way. And if you go to the origin of the gay rights movement in like the 60s New York, in the modern sense, that's exactly why there were trans women at Stonewall with gay men, because they were discriminated against in the same way. So I just think the LGB without the T stuff is just ahistorical. In like a really weird, embarrassing way, I feel like. Because those are also the people who try to front like their the like last people preserving logic.
I mean, you're approaching it from a historical viewpoint. What about from a modern viewpoint where, let's say, cis gay people face a lot less discrimination? And I mean, you can look in Germany, two of the most right-wing figures in German politics, Alice Weidel and Jens Spahn, are gay. And Germany, I saw a recent poll, it's the country in the world where like the second best for viewing gayness as a moral issue. So along with Sweden, very, very few Germans believe that being gay is a moral issue or immoral. So do you think now, like, maybe gays are not that oppressed and trans people are? So maybe
I think gay people are still quite oppressed. And I think, unfortunately, that's also, specifically in Germany, part of the delegitimizing of the trans rights movement is that it's often painted as being homophobic by certain types of people because of this perceived divide in their struggles. But I do think they're still linked, because I think those social patterns of how queerphobia functions in general still doesn't really discriminate based on identity or sexuality. I do think that there are aspects in which homosexual men and women have had more legal wins than trans people, which might result in certain people thinking they have more privilege than others. But I don't really think socially that's exactly the same. And I think that's also a discussion that's happened in gay rights movements for decades.
So why would trans people be homophobic? Or why are they accused of that?
Because of stuff like policies in Iran and like viewpoints that seem to interpret transitioning as a means of getting away from homosexuality. Yeah. But I feel like we got off track from what I was saying about the German healthcare system. Is just very demeaning, because even though I could present the story that people were looking for, there were still a lot of doctors just asking very degrading things, like asking you how you masturbate. There's doctors in Berlin who when before they diagnose you with gender dysphoria, they rule out that you're not a pedophile and that you don't want to fuck animals. These are things that are still done in 2026.
You get asked about bestiality,
pedophilia.
Wow.
And so it can be quite degrading. Yeah.
Sure. And then, you end up going into a fitness studio after you go through it all, and you get terminated because of that.
And then you sort of learn that, like, I thought that at some point, if I was like a good trans woman and I integrated into society, then I would be accepted. But I think something that really changed my perspective was one time where I was at a gynecologist's office after getting my sex change. And when I told her that I was trans, it wasn't an issue at all. But then the second I mentioned it, she refused to treat me. And she said it wasn't natural.
Wow.
Even though she fully saw my body, did not know that I was trans.
Oh my God.
Afterwards, it all of a sudden was an issue. And that was a really huge, like, I think my views were fairly transpositive before then, but I think that really shifted them in a more unapologetic direction, because that showed me, like, oh, there is no escaping this, because the second that people identify you in a certain way, they'll treat you differently.
So it really, in your sense, in that case, it was like really a invisible minority, because a doctor had seen you and couldn't see you.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting.
It's confirmation bias. And I think with the transphobia, it gives people an easy way to categorize us and therefore view us differently.
I mean, it just sounds like prejudice from a very simple perspective.
Yeah,
from a doctor, from a gynecologist.
That person ended up treating me after I asked her to put it in writing, which is very the German game.
Okay.
And then I walked out with a prescription for antibiotics, because she confirmed that I had a vaginal infection, but she wouldn't treat me because I was trans.
That's super interesting.
Yeah.
Without wanting to go too much into the nitty gritty, back onto this topic of kind of different types of sexual minorities. What do you think? There's also a different way that, like, binary trans people, so trans men and trans women, are treated from non-binary people, and also, what do you think of FLINTA?
I fucking hate FLINTA, and I've been kind of become infamous on the internet for hating FLINTA.
What do you hate about it? Because I have to say I don't like it, but I can't. For me, I just think it's strange that trans men are included in this group, which is kind of female heavy, female dominant in a sense, and it's like, do we have to? Surely the trans men should be with the men and not welcome in these spaces. But maybe that's a misunderstanding of queer spaces by someone who's not in them very often.
No, I think FLINTA is different than queer, because my hatred for FLINTA, I feel like it's best summarized in 3 points. The first one is the term doesn't fucking make sense. People say, oh, it's about no cis men, it's about no men, but trans men are allowed. Are they not men?
That was the point I was trying to make.
Yeah. So then, oh no cis men. Okay, but there are technically intersex people who are cis men. And for people who don't know what this term is, it means Frauen, Lesben, inter, nicht binär, trans, agender. So,
and why do you even need to mention the lesbian in a sense? Isn't that included?
yeah,
All lesbian are women, right? Like, or well, maybe not. We can come to that as well.
yeah, it's well, so okay, so the term is not specific. It pretends to be specific, but then you realize, oh, it's actually used each time differently. But then the second part that I find very dubious is how it's applied. In that a lot of trans people, these are spaces that are allegedly allow trans women in, but I know people who have been asked to leave FLINTA parties because they had a beard or something. And just like it clearly, it's kind of become women and people I see as women, or I see who are enough like women. And so I coined a phrase last year where I said, "Don't say FLINTA if you mean pussy." And that became like a meme in German internet culture. And so I just think that those two things are problematic and just inefficient if the goal is to do that. But the third point, which I think is more, in my opinion, important, is that unlike queer spaces and spaces that where people go to seek out people who are similar to them and who regulate their spaces based on that so people feel more comfortable. FLINTA is this really weird liberal German artifact in which people take a moral stance on the exclusion of other people. Gay men excluding anyone else from their spaces, it's just because they're horny. They want to fuck. They don't want to see non-men there. I think it's weird and shitty and I don't really get it, but they're not. I mean, there are transphobic gay men, but there are also queer spaces where people say, like, this is a lesbian-only party, so lesbians are here. Those are situations where I can understand why you want to exclude other people.
Because it's like a party where you're trying to meet people.
And also there are like community spaces that are BIPOC-focused and like things like that, where I can understand, like, okay, this is like the point of this space is to provide resources for a particular marginalized group. But FLINTA is a product of this German liberalism, which makes it seem like spaces are morally pure / safer if cis men, whatever, aren't there. And that's what I mostly take issue with. That's what I think is very insidious about it. Because they make it a moral issue in a way that I feel stereotypes people, and it doesn't really address it's very unproductive. And I think somebody asked me on like an Instagram post, what other phrase should I use to describe spaces where I don't want men there? And I was like, I would rather ask yourself why you think excluding a particular group of people because of their identity inherently makes a space safer.
Especially if you are actually including a particular category of men, i.e. trans men.
Yeah.
Right?
And someone replied statistics, and I was like, okay, but that's not...
Isn't that also an argument that like right-wingers would make about excluding certain races or nationalities?
It's like I don't think statistics, regardless of what they are good enough to discriminate against people. I think statistics, they're viewed as like these objective things, but they tell stories. They're curated. They are windows into certain perspectives. And so I just don't really take that seriously.
Is it this kind of not all men but always a man perspective?
Well, I think I do think that the two are similar, but I think that is a bit different. Because I do generally agree with that, because I feel like that's in a discussion about usually straight men who are abusing women, which is a more well-documented phenomenon. Whereas FLINTA is saying even gay men aren't safe because straight men rape women. And I don't really follow that logic.
I think
gay men can be misogynistic. I've seen it happen.
Sure.
It's tale as old as time. But I don't really understand.
Why gay men have to be kicked out of a certain type of like queer.
It feels like it shouldn't.
Space.
I feel like it shouldn't be a hot take that I'm not really pro-segregation in these types of spaces, but that's how I have to frame it, because I just don't. I think that if safety is the issue, we should focus on safety and not these weird. I can say as a trans woman, I don't inherently feel safer around women. I sought out male doctors when I was transitioning at the beginning because I had some really awful experiences with women specifically. And I sort of accepted, if a man is going to treat me like I'm not normal. I would rather have it be someone who I'm not trying to be like, instead of a woman who treats me like I'm a monster. So it's like, it's a whole thing. I think it's an unfortunate term that I am very shocked has become so mainstream and so widely accepted. But ever since I moved here, I've heard trans people talk about how much they hate FLINTA and stuff. And so, but no one's ever said anything about it. Like, at least in like a way that is truly unapologetic. And so I started talking about it, and I've gotten some hate from people. But I've gotten more messages from people being like, "Thank you for saying this."
I mean, yeah, that's a question about social dynamics and social media anyway, right? Like, why is it that having a hot take on a particular social phenomenon, which in this case would be FLINTA, why is it that some people react so angrily to being challenged? Because how old is FLINTA actually? I, first started coming here about 10 years ago, 12 years ago maybe, and that was when I first heard about like FLINTA, and I was kind of, okay, it seems interesting. The jury's out for me, but
I think the origin, God, I think it's late 90s.
and has it been widespread for that long?
No. I think widespread the last 15, 20 years. I'm also completely making this up, so I could be wrong. I should probably stick to things I actually know.
Sure, but yeah, that's your feeling. That's your that's your lived that's your lived experience.
That's my lived experience, and you should respect it.
Yeah. How do you feel about that kind of narrative about?
Well, that's
lived
also.
experience?
I feel like you just mentioned that. Like, why do people? Why? I think people are upset that I take issue with FLINTA stuff, because there is so much of what you just said about this sort of like, this thing makes me feel comfortable, therefore you shouldn't criticize it, or like you have to agree with it simply because it makes me comfortable, or like you're not allowed to challenge it. And I remember a year ago when I first posted that, like, don't say FLINTA if you mean pussy, a bunch of people were like, what about queer people who take solace in this term? And I remember posting my Instagram story, like, super panicked, be like, I'm not referring to those people. But a year later, I absolutely was referring to those people. And that's totally, I don't know why I just like was trying to save face by not saying what I thought. But I think it was because that
you didn't want to hurt people.
I didn't want to hurt people, but I read there's a really great, I'm assuming you're familiar with Sarah Schulman.
Rings a bell. Oh, she's the trans writer in the US.
Not trans rights, but she's a feminist author who's been very vocal about Palestine as well in her work.
Okay, yeah.
She has a great book called Conflict is Not Abuse. Which was written way before cancel culture. It was mainly used to describe police brutality and like queer communities and Israel and Palestine. It's a really fabulous book, and it really like specifically the parts on queer communities and how it's called like overstating harm. That's the term that she uses, and she talks a lot about how a lot of minority groups who are persecuted will adopt similar ideologies of supremacy to in sort of a self-defense and apply it to other people. And she makes some really insightful criticisms of how modern queer rights movements do that a lot, and how they socially require, like, she doesn't say moral purity, but how it sort of weeds out people and doesn't focus on communal support, but more like communal scapegoating and stuff. And that really had an influence on me. And I'm still kind of, I think it's hard in this sort of social media age to really hold myself to that. But because I think I don't think anyone likes getting backlash, but I think I feel much more satisfied with myself when I sort of am more honest about, like, it's okay, you can be uncomfortable. Like, conflict is not abuse. Like, it's fine if you don't like a take that I have.
Right. I mean, this is something I encounter sometimes. People who are like, there's something I believe quite strongly. It's a bit off topic, but I'm very pro nuclear energy. And that's something which is kind of right wing coded in Germany. I think unfairly, but and for me, it just makes a lot of sense. I've thought about it a lot. I've done some energy reporting, whatever. And the vitriol you get sometimes from people, I'm like, guys, I'm talking about a different type of energy. Like, I'm not talking about, but sometimes people take these things really personal, and that's a topic which is not even that personal in a sense, right?
Yeah.
So, what happened to being able to disagree?
Well, Yeah, I don't know. I've been trying to, I feel like in my general online presence, since I stopped giving a fuck, I think I've started pushing back on stuff like that. Like a few weeks ago, I made a joke in which it was just like a dumb joke. So I just post whatever dumb thoughts I have to the internet.
Mm.
And one of them was like, I don't know any gay people who want to be straight, but I know many straight women, myself included, who would pay money to become lesbian. So maybe the issue with conversion therapy is the homophobia and not the business model. And I just like
I love
not
it.
thinking, I just posted that on Instagram and someone commented like a really long paragraph about like how problematic it was that I was making lesbianism seem like something that someone can choose or something. And they wrote this huge thing and I just replied, I'm fine with being problematic. Like,
Mm.
like it's not, whatever.
There's
I don't think I'm intentionally being harmful with my humor.
I
But
mean,
I think it's fine to have like these disagreements on things that I do think are minute semantics.
I think there's in a way that maybe there's two types of kind of content, political content creation. There's at least two types. There's the kinds which are about defining a worldview. There's people who will post that white people cannot be victims of racism, full stop.
Yeah.
And it's about like it's about, or trans people cannot be homophobe or something like that. And then there are people who are interested in picking apart the inherent contradictions, because I think in something as complicated as gender politics or intersectionality, woke kind of neoliberal identity politics more general, there's always going to be some kind of tensions and edge cases, right?
Yeah.
And I think in the trans sphere, you see that in like trans content creation, you see that a bit more around non-binary people, because I think there's a kind of quite simple narrative which you alluded to earlier of like, I was born kind of in the wrong body, and I was always a woman, and but I was born a man and I need to change. And I personally think a lot of society can get behind that. It's in a way it's challenging, but it's not that challenging. And then there are people who come with a very different narrative, which is, from my perspective, it's very different. It's like there's actually a lot of different genders, and I can define it, and you kind of have to accept that. So I can be a woman but have a beard and a man's name, and if you have a problem with that, then you are transphobic or you're problematic or whatever.
Yeah.
And what do you think about that kind of type? And then, there are people who might try and pick that apart, or there are people who might just say, okay, listen, they've said it. It's their identity. You have to accept that. What do you feel? How do you feel about that approach?
Okay. I think that is really, I find that very fascinating because I think it is a different type of transphobia, but I think two things are happening that are often conflated as the same thing. And I think the first thing is that non-binary people, or I mean, I guess that term is relatively new, but people who identify as either a third gender or outside of the gender binary, that's something that's happened as long as humans have happened. So many documented cases of that in indigenous communities, in various cultures throughout history.
Even in Italy.
Yeah.
There were groups.
Yeah, I mean, it's all over the world. There have been people who don't identify within a gender binary. And that's also a medical thing. There are people who medically feel gender dysphoria in particular ways, who don't feel it in other ways, who don't necessarily feel the whole thing of like, I need to get every single surgery. That's not medically necessary for to be viewed as trans. So I think that is totally real. I think, however, I think the issue in a lot of online queer spaces is that sort of dogmatic thinking that you're referring to, of like, I feel this way, therefore you must respect it. And I don't think that, I think it's very presumptuous. I grew up on Tumblr. I used to be like that. I grew up on Tumblr during like the peak of like the modern day social justice resurgence, in which like it's not my job to educate you was like a rallying cry for people who were too scared to order pizza over the phone, but still wanted like meaningful political change. And I was one of those people, and I thought that was very useful. But then I think I saw the rise of Trump. I saw the recent radicalization of U.S. American politics where I come from. over the past 10 years. And that really changed my perspective on like what is genuinely useful. Because I think something that the left really suffers from is that right-wing people are very not maybe not friendly, but very willing to provide educational resources on why people should hate certain groups of people. And so I'm not really I'm very jaded by the smugness that you describe of people who think that respect, you don't have to understand me, you just have to respect me.
Mm.
You absolutely have to understand me, or else you're not going to know how to advocate for me. And that's why we have people saying trans women are women, but they couldn't actually explain why that is or what that even means. I think it's just like not politically useful.
Mm. And I wonder, because in a sense, I think it's shifted a little bit and that there is a lot of educational content, but it's still very dogmatic because it's about this Aufklärungsarbeit, right? It's about this idea like, well, and, a lot of this I personally believe that is linked to kind of algorithms and that kind of like, when it's very mediated by particular formats of content. And so it's like, let me tell you 3 reasons why, non-binary people don't owe you X, Y, Z, and and in a certain sense, obviously that's true. But in another way, don't we all owe each other a certain... So my kind of big narrative on this is like, make socialism social again, and that means we can have discussions, respectful discussions, and we don't tell each other what to do. We like try and convince, and you might sometimes have honest disagreements, but you can also approach each other from a place of respect and sometimes different opinions, and I think that's all right.
Sorry.
I wonder if sometimes this. I've noticed personally more of this kind of dogmatic approach from certain non-binary influencers, which I believe is somehow a little bit more of an ask for society, that rather than saying like, some men are born as women and vice versa. That's something I think, my grandma could get behind. The ask is like, there are some people have, non-binary genders, some people are agender, some people are, two spirits. Like, of course, I'm going back 10 years in a right-wing meme in a sense to say that there are 52 genders, but I feel like it's a bit harder to convince society. What do you think about that?
I can understand that it's more to convince society, but I actually think it's much easier to convince people that this shit doesn't matter. I think that's much easier to swallow than a man can become a woman. I feel like there's a reason.
Live and let live, basically.
Live and let live. I mean, I'm very pro gender fuckery, and I think, there are reasons why a lot of like children don't grow up with these types of prejudices because they're sort of learned. And so even though I do think that certain like discussions about things might be overwhelming for people who don't understand it, like with neopronouns or something. I do think in general, the perspective of like, who gives a fuck is much easier. And I think much easier for older people to understand. I've seen that a lot.
And that used to be the narrative of like, I might not agree with you, but I think you've got your right to say it kind of thing. And I feel like it's shifted to the point where we have to have a lot of information and agree with it all. It's like, because we're told, if you don't believe X, then you are Y. And it's like, maybe I don't have to believe X. And I can just, leave you to do your thing, which doesn't really impact me that much. I don't know that many... agender people. I know a few actually, but no, I'm not sure how many non-binary people I know. I feel like it's not a big part of my life or my politics, and somehow it seems to be quite a big phenomenon in certain online. And one issue you have is certain trans people almost rage baiting. There's one influencer in particular in the US who's quite notorious. I think Lily is her name?
Tino.
Lily Tino.
I'll say her name.
Okay.
I have her blocked.
Okay. Well, exactly, because she has a very confrontational style of like, she doesn't pass that well, and films herself eating like burgers a lot, which is just very American, and sometimes gets referred to like misgendered, and then like films them and confronts them, and what do you think? Why do you have her blocked?
Because I think she's fucking annoying, and I think that and I think the content that she does is a good example of something that I genuinely do think hurts the trans rights movement. I think Lily Tino is sort of like a talking point where like a lot of trans people are asked to disavow her. I just don't really give a fuck about her. I don't think that like she's the reason for transphobia in America, because clearly that's not true. I do think she's careless in the way she presents herself online, in a way that I think in many aspects does play into stereotypes of how people view trans people. But I can also say that and recognize that I don't think the trans person is most at fault for the transphobia, if that makes sense. I think both can exist. And I think with non-binary people, like you mentioned, that non-binary people get associated with this particular element of like prioritizing comfort and respect and not really and sort of being very dogmatic. I think what I feel like I've thought about this a lot recently. I was telling a non-binary friend that I do think that like prejudice towards non-binary people is in a way feels more insidious than the prejudice I receive as a trans woman, because I feel like the whole non-binary thing and the prejudice that they receive is focused on you are not real. And that's different. I don't think anyone would say that I'm not real. They would just say that I'm a pervert man in a dress, which is like also awful, but it's a bit less existential because I know the reality I live. I know how the world treats me. I know how I exist in the world as a woman. So someone saying that isn't really going to change my reality. Whereas I feel like there is a really weird existential threat of that. But I do think that and I think because of that, the response is often you are valid. You exist. And I think that's where those sorts of comfort things come from, is because they come from a social response that is focused on denying your existence. And so a lot of people take comfort in reaffirming their existence. I don't really have an interest in that sort of side of politics. I just don't really think it's that effective. I am more interested in convincing people instead of I referenced earlier like the phrase trans women are women. That's just like something that gets bantered around and people act like being progressive means just saying that, not really understanding it. I'm wholly against that. It serves no political function. If anything, it hurts us. Because there are so many people who are very well read on why trans women aren't women. And I couldn't really tell you a single cis person who says that, who genuinely understands that can also be changed, like I referenced earlier.
I mean, it's really interesting you say this, because I saw this week, I believe, someone going up, and a right-wing kind of content creator going up and saying, trans women are women, why? And the person couldn't answer.
Yeah,
right?
I think it's dumb. I think it's inefficient.
Do you prefer protect the dolls? Is that your...
Protect the doll? I mean, I prefer nothing in that. Yeah, I don't think many political movements are helped by a single phrase that summarizes these complex issues. But I do think protect the doll is probably more efficient. Because the focus isn't on summarizing a complex social issue into a single sentence, but instead summarizing an action. Same with like protect trans kids or something. The focus is on protection, not really understanding. And I think that's where the right wing transphobic people get off and are unfortunately very pragmatic about being able to corner trans rights, people who say they're for trans rights, because they genuinely don't understand why they're for trans rights, like well-meaning allies or whatever. But I do think with non-binary people, I just wanted to say that I think part of the reason as well, aside from the valid thing and how that gets twisted into this sort of like comfort thing, which I think becomes a sort of cringe in online culture, I do think the cringe label is therefore associated with non-binary people because of these social spaces. But I don't think that is unique to non-binary people. I think it's unique to non-passing trans people in online culture. And I think that is why someone like Lily Tino is bunched in with non-binary people. Not because that non-binary is, or being a trans woman is cringe, but because that society, when they trans experience and the oppression we face is about people saying, I don't know what you're going through, but I know how to diagnose it and I know how to control it. I will control what medicine you're allowed to have. I will control how you're allowed to dress yourself. I will control how you're allowed to exist legally. medically whatever in society. And so the whole cringe thing is predicated on this stereotype that they can identify us. And when they can identify us, then they have permission to ridicule us. And so I do think that there's a bad rap with non-binary people on the internet because of how people don't understand the difference between a non-passing trans woman and a non-binary person. And so they think, oh, that's what you see this in Germany with, they call it gender Wahnsinn. Like they say that, and it's like, what the fuck does that mean? It doesn't really mean anything. But at the same time, you know what it means, because they mean like
genderqueer, anyone outside of the binary.
Yeah, they mean
perceived as outside.
Well, I don't even think they mean genderqueer. They mean non-passing trans people. They mean people who aren't easily able to be categorized in the system that people exist in.
I mean, you pass pretty well. I mean, you don't need me to say that. You've proven it. You're proving it through the court of law and stuff as well, right? But do you think that trans people have they should try and pass?
No. I think that makes it appear as though passing is something that everyone can achieve. And that's not really true. And I referenced earlier as well that my being white factors into my ability to move within Germany, because people of color, like Black trans women, for instance, are more discriminated against medically because their type of femininity might be perceived as there are so many racist undertones to how Black women might be racist, perceived as masculine or something. And so that also has an effect on how someone is perceived by society. So I think there are a lot of trans people, there are a lot of trans figures in Germany. I will say one name, a trans woman named Persia X, who's very active on YouTube, who has made a career of sort of presenting, nach meiner Meinung, just my opinion, a certain type of transness. And I think that's a shame. I think it's
very feminine one.
A very feminine one, but also very often criticized non-binary people. And I think that is something that's a very popular script. I think when I see her videos, I think of Blair White, Calvin Guerra, these people who are American influencers who have had a lot of success. I don't think Calvin Guerra is active anymore, but who've had a lot of success making careers off of making videos essentially ridiculing other trans people. And I think it's kind of a shame to see people do that. I personally don't really think there's any spine to it. I think it's a very hollow political gesture, and yeah.
Do you think, on the other hand, that sometimes non-binary people who are kind of, let's say, invisibly non-binary, right? You can't tell they're non-binary. Often they are AFAB, assigned female at birth. Do you think there's an element of kind of stolen valor to them identifying as trans? They haven't had to go through much. They haven't had to change anything. They haven't had to transition in the same sense that you have, medically, socially, but they define themselves as non-binary. I'm thinking particularly, you just made me think of this Piers Morgan debate with, was that with Blair White and Ellen Penny, who I used to follow years back, and is as a left-wing kind of feminist writer. And, one day she came out as non-binary. Good for them. And but she interjects in this that she's also that they're also trans. And it makes me wonder, how much do you have to transition if you're a kind of previously were seen as a bit of a tomboy feminist, and then suddenly you're non-binary?
I think it's such a complicated issue, because I think the reason why the discussion about stolen valor comes is because of how identity politics have intersected with queerness. I think identity politics began as a really well-pointed, a really concise definition of people in marginalized groups, specifically like Black Americans, who were articulating that certain people cannot understand their lived experience and what it means to be a Black person in the U.S.
Mm.
And phrases like emotional labor and stuff were specifically for this purpose, to describe the constant expectation of certain marginalized groups to explain themselves. And through the internet of the last 20 years, 15 to 20 years, I think that's been twisted and adopted in queer communities to avoid discomfort, like you mentioned, like we were talking about earlier.
Or
And
is it about avoiding discomfort always? Because I get the impression, not specifically in queer communities, but sometimes it's about asserting a certain social power that comes from being marginalized in a kind of perverse way. Like, I'm more marginalized according to
yeah,
this set of values, and it's quite rigid. Often it's multiple intersections including X, Y, and Z, and that gives them, in a sense, more right to speak, or not more right to speak, but more right to be listened to.
yeah, and I think that's what I think. I don't. Yeah, so I think the reason why that's how identity politics is developed, in that like identity is a currency. And so that is why people who say like I identify a certain way and therefore I like someone who, this is a conversation in so many trans communities about like a trans woman who comes up, it doesn't change her appearance.
Mm,
And then references being discriminated against in the same way that like a fully like a trans woman who was just hate crimed was experienced.
mm.
And that is something I think is genuinely problematic, because it uses identity as currency in a way that I think drifts from the original purpose of that sort of stuff, which was to show how first person perspective should be taken more seriously in political discussions about how people are like how to break out of oppression. Um at the same time though, um I do think that that I feel like I'm personally very careful to avoid. I think with transphobia, it's so nuanced that it's difficult. Like, I think some people would say that trans women, it's like, I've heard it in FLINTA spaces, but I've also heard it used by TERFs. Like, a main talking point is that they were socialized as men, therefore
Mm,
they grew up with male privilege. And that's viewed as like a currency that they had that they threw away.
mm.
And I think that's problematic because it ignores the currency, or like the incredible anguish of being a trans woman trapped as a man in society. And I do think that there are people who use certain terms as stolen valor, who
I thought I was being original with that. I didn't realize it was.
well, I think it's a nuanced thing. I think there are people who use identity as a bargaining chip in a way that I don't really think should have much social relevance in how we talk about which parts of the community are people that we should prioritize in terms of protecting people. Like,
Mm.
I'm always like more interested in helping trans people like get medicine and housing than
Mm.
caring about if someone, I don't know, just like in getting involved in internet petty politics.
Well, that's the thing. There's a certain irony in pointing this out on like an interview podcast, but I think a lot of the time, identity politics just means endless discussion, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like that's something I have a big issue with, because in a sense, you can point out and create a very wide schema of how much different identities are oppressed in different ways. Like, if you are, let's say, Pacific Islander and non-binary and disabled, and some people
Mhm.
will say, listen, you can't disagree with me because I'm autistic, disabled, trans, and and
Yeah.
I feel like so much politics in these spaces has been about discussing how all of these identities intersect. And this is an issue I have with a bit of this kind of intersectional approach, not with the concept itself, but the way it works out, that we forgot to actually do politics.
Yeah, well, I mean, I mainly do comedy now, so it's not like I'm exactly a political activist, in the same way that a lot of people are on social media. But I do think that, that I I just wholeheartedly disagree with, like, I am this, therefore you have to listen to me. And I think that manifests in, like, petty disagreements between, like, the person who criticized me for making that joke about, like, conversion therapy, and seemed to imply that I was, like, someone wrote me after that and said, like, "You're hurting the this is what hurts the queer community." And my response was like, "Okay, maybe the queer community could be fucking stronger if a tranny on Instagram can take it down with a joke." Like, that clearly I'm not the symbol of queerphobia.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it is also more, it can become, oh shit, I forgot what I was gonna say.
Let me interject. I think there is, just to come back to what you said about comfort and
Yeah.
conflict is not harm. There is often this narrative of like, how could you do that? You're hurting me. How could you disagree with me? That kind of causes me pain.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I feel like that assumes a certain level of like empathy, which I feel it's not always given. It's like you're from a privileged group and we hate you, or like they'll joke about that.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
think it's real hate, but that's kind of an acceptable joke, like fuck men, fuck whites, whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it's like, if you disagree with me, that's actual violence. You're hurting me, and I could die. And then there's this really evil voice in the back of my head that goes like, so die, because not because I believe that, obviously, but just because I feel it's not like a solidarity or a two-way street of empathy. I think it's just a case of like, is this a quite cynical way of you controlling how I'm supposed to speak?
I think it's controlling. I do think the Sarah Schulman book is a great text on that, because I do think it is creating what she refers to as like supremacist structures to navigate conversation and control conversation. That is often done by people of marginalized groups who are marginalized and that's their way of taking power in a situation. I do think, to be specific, in Germany, I think that hurts trans rights, because right now we're in a sort of really weird catch-22, where after a few years of the Me Too movement, people have said things like "believe all women," which is in theory not a bad idea. Believe people who are victims of oppression and like rape and sexual abuse, but when combined with "I experience this, therefore you must not only listen to me, but also agree with me and agree with whatever I say," that's led us to a particular situation where a lot of TERFs, a lot of transphobic feminists in Germany, say, "I'm a victim of sexual assault, therefore I can't be in a fitness studio or a sauna with a trans woman who has a penis. Because a man raped me, this trans woman is somehow triggering to me." And the fact that we view that as a rational political position and not a disturbing trauma response from someone who desperately needs therapy for sexual assault is something that I think is honestly a failure of these sorts of liberal politics, where it's like, I am this, therefore you must do this, has led to this particular situation. And I've talked about this pretty openly on the internet, because I'm very openly a victim of sexual assault multiple times throughout my life, and since childhood. And I said on a podcast one time that, like, I can understand why someone might be afraid, but I try to not make my trauma other people's problem.
Mm.
I don't think if a woman was raped by a lesbian, that gives her the right to say, "I don't want lesbians in my space." It would be like, shut up. Like, why do you think that you experiencing something means that you get to discriminate? And I think when we allow those narratives to take hold, then they sort of embolden stereotypes. Like, I know with the trans woman and the penis thing, there's this idea that like trans women have like hairy, fucking huge horse cocks and stuff that are swords that they're using to kill people. And the reality is that if you're on estrogen, the penis is like shriveled up. It looks like just a huge clitoris for many people.
Thanks for
It's
that info. I wasn't actually
the
aware.
the feminine penis is much different than the masculine penis. It seems, and conversely, the masculine clitoris is much different. It enlarges to be like a mini dick. So it's like, when we allow trauma to take hold of a conversation, it distorts it, because that's what trauma does. It's very disturbing, and
It's irrational, right?
It's irrational, and somehow that's been allowed in Germany to be normalized. And I think that's maybe it's a good note to end on. I think that's a very bad impulse to just accept unquestionably. And I say that with an immense amount of empathy for anyone who's also been through the horror of sexual abuse. But that
I wanted
Doesn't
to
have
end,
to be my problem.
I wanted to
Sorry.
end on a lighter note, but I mean, what an interesting conversation. I feel like we learned a lot. I certainly did as well, and some really interesting perspectives on politics and how it's done in the internet age, as well as the realities of living as a trans person, trans woman in Germany, and content creation. So, Avelo, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.